Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Allouche. I am ESM Prep's Director of Testing, and I am joined by Brian Smith, Senior Test Prep Mentor, to talk about test prep for the summer of 2023. We have a lot of rising juniors and some rising seniors that are planning to use this summer effectively to do their test prep for the SAT or ACT, and we're going to demystify all of the little factors that go into deciding to do that, how to do it, and then whether you should be doing it this summer or next spring. It's a fun year to talk about this stuff, so Brian and I have a lot to cover. Brian, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well, Adam. How about you?
I am good. This is probably the hardest one of these we've ever done for reasons we'll explain later. There are just huge changes to the SAT and a change coming to the ACT that make this decision a little less clear than any class has had before. So for those of you that are in the graduating class of 2025, we're sorry in advance. Today, we're going to cover a little update on the test optional landscape and college admissions. Ever since COVID, we've had a wave of test optional policies, and we want to tell you what that really means for students. We'll update you on the upcoming digital SAT that's set to hit the US in March 2024, catch you up on what's happening with the ACT and the computer-based tests that they've recently announced. And then we'll spend the most of our time comparing these tests and giving you some guidance on whether or not prepping this summer for a test in the fall or prepping in the spring for a spring test makes the most sense for your student. Okay, so for those of you that have watched the webinar with me before, you've heard me give the spiel. Ever since COVID hit in 2020, almost every school in the country went to a test optional policy for admissions, which basically stated that you could submit a score if you think it's additive to your application, but if you don't have a score or you don't wish to not submit a score, you won't be hurt in any way when it comes to deciding whether you're going to be admitted or not. So schools have kept that policy for the large part ever since 2020. What they were able to see is that their application numbers rose significantly because they're not taking in a greater number of kids. Their admit rate went down. Their average test scores actually went up because those that submitted test scores were submitting high test scores. And so schools look much more selective and much more impressive in this test optional world. So because they're getting more applications and getting more money in for the door for admissions offices, because they look better, we expect these policies to stay. We've only seen really a handful of school and school systems adopt that test required policy going forward. Georgetown, MIT, the military academies, some of the southern state school systems have gone back to test required. The only other option for a policy is a test blind or test free policy. And that's what we're seeing at the UC system and the CSU system. That is true test equity. That is when students do not submit test scores at all. It is not a part of their calculus. So everyone is judged the same based on their GPA, their extracurriculars, to see who gets in or not. For the most part, students that are coming from metropolitan areas, higher income areas, that are coming from impressive, whether it's an impressive public or impressive private high school, should be testing because they are getting compared to students of their similar demographics that are also testing. So we just don't want students to be the one person that doesn't have a test score when all else is equal. We just still are seeing that schools are admitting students that take these tests and test well. You can see a rough breakdown of the testing advantage here between 8 very, very popular and very elite schools, where you see a wide range of testing advantage. And that wide range is also why we recommend testing. Test optional is not created equal. There are schools like Tufts, for example, that pride themselves in admitting half of their incoming classes with test scores and half without. There are schools that just frankly don't tell you anything about this process. So you're not going to be able to build out a list of schools that are either test blind or truly test optional. So if you are able to test and test well, we really recommend that you do that. Okay, Brian, what everybody's been waiting for, what we've been working on for over a year now, the digital SAT is finally here for the class of 2025. Can you catch people up on what we've learned about this test based on our work for students that have been taking this test internationally since March?
Yeah, so that's the first thing. This test has already been released internationally. We've already had more than a few students take it, and it's kind of get an experience of what the kind of test looks like and what it's feeling. And it'll be coming to the US starting in October for the PSAT, and for the first official SAT, it will be March 2024. And so what it is basically a complete computer version of the paper SAT. Although that said, it's not just changing from being paper to computer format. There are also changes to the format of the test itself. First, one biggest one for a lot of students is the test is now significantly shorter. It was originally on paper 3 hours. Now it's only a 2-hour test. And that's because there's only 2 sections. There's reading, writing, and math. And also, this is the other huge change, is now what we call an adaptive test. That basically means that, like, based on how you perform on the first modules, what we call, you will get a different module on that section depending on how well you do. So on the first math section, if you do very well on it, the second module will be a harder module that if you do well on it will allow you to achieve at a higher score level. This is kind of how they get away with kind of making a shorter test, but still scoring it the same as before. It's still scored out of 1600, 800 reading, writing, and 800 math. So it's a very different test. I mean, a lot of the concepts that's tested are the same. It's still mostly the same math as the paper SAT, mostly the same grammar with a few kind of small changes here and there, but the test experience was greatly changed. And I think the general consensus, like for most students, that this is a much more convenient test to take now, much better testing experience. It doesn't feel as hard. It doesn't mean it actually is easier. It just doesn't feel as hard as it did before. It just goes much smoother and it's much quicker. So it's a lot easier to take the test in general. So we've had a lot of positive feedback from students who've taken it. It really just kind of seems like this was a change for the better, right? In terms of preparing it for it, we'll have to see. But so far, it does seem kind of easier to prepare for it as well, too, generally speaking, I will say.
And some of your students actually might have gotten an unofficial preview of this test. There was a lot of unofficial PSATs offered at some schools that gave students an unofficial look at what that test might look like. So you might already have a practice test score from the October 2022 PSAT given through your school. Okay, what's the ACT been up to? Recently, they announced that starting in December, they are going to be rolling out their computer-based test in the US. This is a test form that has been offered exclusively internationally since 2018. It is not as seismic as a change as the switch from the paper SAT to the digital SAT, because the format of the test is the same. It's the same length of per section. It's the same rollout of 4 passages in reading with 10 questions each, 75 questions in the English test. All the things we know about the ACT are not changing. The scoring's not changing. It is simply just being given on computer rather than paper. That does change your strategy a bit. It doesn't allow you to annotate as easily in a reading passage, for example. You can't mark up a math figure like you can on paper, but it's largely the same test. So it's not we don't know exactly how they're going to roll this out. We know that they're going to give it to 5,000 students starting in December. We don't know where those students are going to be located or where this test is going to be offered. We'll kind of learn more about that in the middle of July when registration opens. But right now, we're not really recommending this test. From our experience with this test internationally, the strategies that make the ACT a test that students can really improve on are on paper. You can, like I said, mark up reading passages. You can take notes in the test booklet. And there's been issues with the CBT itself internationally. Most recently on the June test, we have a lot of students in the UK who had a handful of math questions just not have operators. So they didn't know whether they were supposed to multiply or divide, and those scores have been delayed. So we've seen some issues with the CBT internationally. So for those of you that are in the Bay Area, that you might have to decide whether to take the paper or computer-based test just based on convenience. The Bay Area is the hardest place to test in the country. We've had students have to drive 2-3 hours, fly to a different state to take this test. So if the CBT is not popular, you might have the option of saying, well, in December, I can take the computer-based test 15 minutes from my house, but I might have to drive 2 hours to get a paper-based test. That's one of the hardest decisions we're kind of envisioning with the CBT. But all else, in every other scenario, we should have students take the paper ACT.
Yeah, the only other kind of possible advantage for the CBT is that the scores do come back quicker. Although I don't know if they've confirmed that will be the case in the US next year.
Yeah, internationally, it usually takes 2 business days. They usually come out the Tuesday after the test weekend. They have not confirmed that on the ACT website yet. They also promised that when they did the digital SAT internationally, and they've said, oh, we're going to get these scores in days, not weeks, but they're currently on the same score release schedule. So, and
one other quick clarification for the SAT, you cannot choose between digital or paper. Like the paper goes through December and then it switches to digital. Students will not have the choice. Whereas the ACT, they will have the choice between the choose paper and computer.
So just a little bit more background information before we get into the meat of, well, which test should I take? SAT registration is currently open through December 23, both internationally and in the US. So if you are a student that's already decided that you want to take the paper SAT in the fall to try and get testing out of the way, you should go and register for those tests right away, especially if you're in, like I said before, the Bay Area where you really have trouble testing unless we kind of jump up on this early. ACT registration is going to open up in the middle of July for all test dates from September to next July 2024. And again, if you know you're going to take the ACT or even considering it, if it's in a difficult area of the country to test, you should really jump on that registration as soon as it opens. All right, Brian. So as you said, the paper SAT is only available through December 2023. Starting in March, which is the next test date for an SAT, it is completely digital from that point forward. So students have a really interesting to us and difficult for them decision to make, right? Okay, do I take the ACT? If I'm a fast processor, I can take that. It's not changing. It's a known quantity throughout my entire process. Or do I try out the paper SATs or the digital SAT to see, well, should I take the paper one from August through December 2023, or should I wait to take the digital SAT in March to, however long you need to take it, whether that's finishing in June or finishing in the fall of 2024. The main differences on these tests that Brian has already really nicely laid out, that the digital SAT seems to be a more convenient test. There are shorter reading. There is a graphing utility built in that's based on Desmos that can make a lot of things easier for students. It's 2 hours long. And for people with accommodations, that is even amplified, right? Instead of a 4.5-hour test, if you have time and a half, it's only 3 hours. You save an hour and a half instead of an hour. But I think what I need to stress to people is that the test that is convenient or the test that feels nice and easy does not always mean it's a test that you can score highest on. We get a lot of students that take a paper SAT and an ACT diagnostic and say, oh, I like the paper SAT because I had a lot of time, could just nicely, leisurely go through it. And then we look at their scores and they're either the same or the ACT slightly higher. So what is convenient and what feels easiest does not always equate to getting the highest score. And that's where diagnostics come in. The best way to determine whether you should take the ACT, the paper SAT, or the digital SAT is taking a diagnostic and seeing where your scores line up. One of the biggest things that we're advocating in making this decision is the distribution of work throughout the junior year. At ESM, as everybody knows, we do college counseling, academic tutoring, and test prep. So we are so acutely aware of how busy students are in their high school years, especially junior year. Junior year grades are the most important year of grades for college. So if we can lighten the load on one semester or the other, get testing out of the way, or even delay it to lighten the load on how much students have on their plate, that's something we really consider heavily. So for example, if you are a student that plays spring sports and wants to get recruited for that sport, getting this done in the fall is beneficial, even if the digital SAT is slightly easier for you than the paper SAT, as an example, because you'll have a score ready to go into meetings with coaches that are trying to recruit you and say, hey, I already have the score that you want. And you have way more time in the fall because you don't have sports. Now, the reverse is also true. If you have a lot more on your plate in the fall semester, where maybe you play a fall sport or you have more extracurriculars in the fall, maybe waiting to take the digital SAT in the spring makes more sense because you'll have more time to commit in that semester. You can start prep in January and take it through the spring. So when you can test is so important. For a lot of our students, especially our rising juniors that don't have applications to do like our rising seniors do, they have more time this summer than they're going to have at any point in the next year. So getting a jump on testing, even if the paper SAT might be slightly more difficult for a student, is ultimately worth it in our opinion, because you have a chance of getting it done by December and preserving that spring semester when you have not only grades to consider, maybe sports, but also AP exams and the risk of having it bleed into the senior year summer when you have applications, when the stakes feel higher. Brian, did I forget anything in that decision?
Just one thing, like in the worst case situation where you take the paper SATs in the fall, but you aren't satisfied with your scores like in December or whatever, so you end up having to take the digital test, it's not that different. Don't feel like your prep would be like completely wasted if you take the paper SAT there will be a bit of an adjustment, but it's still the SAT. The core is still mostly the same. So like it's not significantly different. So don't be worrying too much about that kind of worst case situation.
And we've seen this already play out internationally, right, Brian? Both you and I have had students that took the December 2022 paper SAT and then switched to the March 2023 digital SAT. What you're really doing there is getting used to a different style of reading comprehension, which is much more shorter, which is paragraph based, and then maximizing how you use that Desmos utility to help you save time and increase accuracy on math questions.
And just from that small sample, the scores translated like pretty closely. Like it wasn't significantly different. Most of my students actually did better on the digital SAT. Well, that's a function of the test itself, or just more prep time, I don't know, but like it was pretty parallel, I would
Absolutely.
say. Yeah.
Okay, so the keys to successful test prep, we've kind of breaking it out in phases. As we've talked about before, the best way to start this process is to take a full-length diagnostic of the test you're considering. So if you're saying, I am going to take tests in the fall, I want to get this out of the way, I know I have more time this summer than I will ever have, what you want to do is take a diagnostic paper SAT and a diagnostic ACT and compare your results and your experiences with those tests. Some students that did very well on their sophomore year PSAT, if they took the paper one, or if they've already taken a practice ACT or SAT at school in the spring of their sophomore year, can use those as a substitute because they've already had that experience and they can save those 3 hours of that diagnostic. After they take those tests, we usually schedule a meeting with their mentor to say, okay, tell me about how rushed you felt on the ACT, or tell me about how you felt with that really difficult reading comprehension on the paper SAT. And after reviewing both tests and getting the input of the student, we can choose a test and a timeline for them to test. So if they get a really great score on the ACT or SAT diagnostic, they're really good candidates to try and take that August SAT, that September ACT, and try to knock this out, hopefully by the end of October. If they need a little bit more time, maybe they will take those tests, but also plan to take, the November SAT or the December and ACT or SAT. After choosing a test, Brian, what is the next step? What is phase one of test prep?
Phase one is just the basics, taking a look at those diagnostics, figuring out, what are the holes, what do we need to work on, right? So that's generally just kind of basic stuff like refreshing on grammar rules, semicolons, apostrophes, that kind of fun stuff. Math topics, algebra 1, took geometry during the COVID lockdowns, don't remember much, got to fix that, right? That kind of stuff. Just the basics, kind of the big stuff, the stuff that can take a lot of work, but are technically easy points that we want to capture as soon as possible, the stuff that we really want to make sure the student knows and is comfortable with before taking their test before the first time, really to improve their score as much as possible in the short term.
Cool. And then that threshold in phase two is really the culmination of all that effort in phase one, right? It's saying, okay, you know how to take every section of this test now. You know a lot more of the concepts you need in math and grammar. Let's see where that initial jump in your practice test goes. Let's take a full-length test and see where we are. And that's where we see the biggest jump for students for the most part. And then after that, the decision-making and the timing of everything comes into play. Are we seeing you getting stuck on a math problem for 5 minutes and you won't let it go because you think you used to know how to do this? Or are you staying with the process and saying, wait, it's better for me to leave these questions behind to maximize my score in the limited time that I do have? And these are all the things that come into phase three. I think. Am I executing like we practiced? Am I able to sit down and take a 3-hour test and finish that ACT science section with the same level of attention to detail that I was using in the English test? And can I manage my test anxiety, my test nerves to make sure that I can be at my best throughout the test? Do I have strategies for bringing myself back into the test if I do feel like I'm getting stressed out? Those are all the things that come in as you prepare in the weeks before your first official test. So some things to keep in mind about summer test prep is that the normal cadence you see in the school year doesn't need to apply. Summers are not created equal. There are vacations, there are camps, there are so many other things that students have. So we really try to make use of the time that students do have available. So instead of that normal 1 90-minute session per week that you might see in the school year, we will load up. We will do 2, 3, even 4 sessions in a week to get phase one done early and when students are available. So you do not have to come up with a regular cadence over the summer. You just need to have time with your mentor to learn the strategies and practice them. And then once you kind of get those first 4 to 5 to 6 sessions done, Brian, in our experience, then you're okay being let loose and saying, hey, you're gone for 2 weeks. Here's some homework that I know you're going to approach the right way because we've already reviewed it. And then we can come and resume our sessions when you're back from whatever vacation or camp you're at.
the basics, that first kind of phase, this is the one where you really want to do intensively. Just kind of, you want to get out of that phase like as soon as possible. Doing it in summer is the best time to do it. It's much harder to do all the basic stuff on the school year when you're on top of learning like literally everything else. Just a chunk of time you want to get to. And once you get kind of to the other phases, then you can be a little bit more flexible with your time and kind of working on stuff.
And those phase 1 sessions, you can schedule on back-to-back days, right? There's not a lot of homework in between those sessions because it's saying, hey, we're going to learn how to do ACT English today. I'm going to teach you the strategy. You're going to see how it works. Tomorrow we're doing math. I don't need you to do English homework before we go over the math section. So you really can bunch those ones up together. And then you can do all that conceptual review that Brian mentioned, on your homework after those first set of meetings. Allow for some flexibility. Like we said, you should come up with an overall plan for your summer with your mentor that says, oh, I know I'm going to get the number of sessions that were recommended before my first test, but it's okay to take breaks, right? Like we want students to take breaks from a very, very busy school year and enjoy their vacations with their family. If you say, hey, what I really need for my mental health is to not have a ton of homework, as long as you're upfront about that and you plan for those gaps where you're not doing homework and enjoying your vacations as you should, we can come up with a plan for it. But when you are doing homework, especially if it's scored, a practice test, a practice section, you need to do it in high quality conditions. So the one thing that we always tell our students, Brian, and half of them listen, I would say, is don't say, hey, yeah, I can take a practice ACT math section when I'm, traveling on a boat in the Mediterranean Sea, no problem. But then you get there and you're like, oh, I really don't want to do this, or I'm distracted, or my little brother's being loud, or there were dolphins next to me distracting me. Right? Those are not high quality conditions, and you're not going to practice the things that are going to help you succeed on this test.
Even doing it like on the plane, like oh, I have so much time on the plane. Like I'm not going to be doing anything else. It never works out. It doesn't. It's just.
So our mentors will meet you in the middle. They'll say, hey, okay, it doesn't sound like you can really commit to this. It doesn't seem like there's a hotel morning that you can do. Why don't you just practice commas? Why don't you practice functions and just do stuff that's not time, that is still additive, but there's no pressure to do it in that's really, test-like condition. Did I miss anything, Brian? Any other successful keys for summer prep?
No, I think you pretty much hit on all the big things. I would say the only other kind of big thing is, do use this time to try to take practice tests as well, right? Like, it's just easier during summer when you have more time available, right? Like, that just take as many as you can possibly fit in, realistically. Especially, it depends a little bit on what phase you're at, but especially if you're in phase 2 or phase 3, it's a great time to just grind through as much as you can there.
And don't feel like you have to have all of this figured out before your first test. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about test prep is like, oh, I'm going to be ready on my very first test to get exactly the score I need, and I'm going to get it, and I'm going to be done. Very few students, even with a great summer of prep, get their highest possible score on their first test because there are nerves. Nerves cause you to deviate. Nerves cause you to spend more time than you should on certain aspects of the test that you weren't spending that time in practice. And so we do see a good jump usually from the first to second or even second to third tests. So our students generally plan to take 3 tests, 1 to get the nerves out and establish a good baseline, 2 where you've learned from that and can increase that score further. And maybe that third test is to round out what's called your super score, which allows you to take your highest section scores across the test. So even if you couldn't get a full 12 sessions in before your August SAT, we still recommend that you try it and you get those nerves out, and then you just kind of double down. Maybe you do an extra couple sessions between the August and October SATs to feel really, really ready for that October test. All right, we covered a lot today, and there's a lot of variables. I can't stress enough how different this decision can be based on what you have going on this summer, what your goals are for college, and what you have on your plate for junior year. So if you have any questions at all, please email us. If you have a college counselor at ESM, you can also talk to them. And I just want parents and students to feel very good about the plan laid forth for them before they start this process. We really try to cover the entire thing, even the contingency of like switching from paper to digital. We will plan out a full 9 to 12 month timeline for your student if it's needed. So please email us. Please get in contact with us if you feel like you really do need a plan of attack here. All right, that's it for today. Brian, it's always a pleasure. For those of you, that have juniors that are getting their SAT scores back today, Friday, June 16th, good luck. And we will talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.